Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Digital Prisons, Electronic Monitoring is a False Solution. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Center for Media Justice, the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center, and Just Leadership USA. The purpose of this webinar is to launch a set of guidelines for respecting the rights of individuals on electronic monitors, and today we'll make the case for why these guidelines are needed now and ask you to join us in our effort. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Maisha Hayes, and I'm the National Organizer on Criminal Justice and Technology at the Center for Media Justice. For those not familiar with the Center for Media Justice, we're a national organizing hub whose mission is to win racial and economic equity in a digital age. We're the host of the nation's largest racial justice network for media, technology, and culture change, known as the Media Action Grassroots Network. We have 100 organizations across the country, many of whom are represented on this call. My work focuses on disrupting the use of technology in the criminal legal system, especially where it unfairly profiles, polices, and punishes communities of color. I'm joined by our campaign partner and lead author of the guidelines, James Kilgore. James Kilgore is an activist, writer, and researcher based in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. He currently leads the challenging e-incarceration project, which focuses on the use of electronic monitoring in the criminal legal system. This project is hosted by the Center for Media Justice and the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center. James received a 2018 Soros Justice Advocacy Fellowship to do this work. He has written widely on mass incarceration and is the author of 5 books, including Understanding Mass Incarceration, A People's Guide to the Key Civil Rights Struggle of Our Time, and 4 novels drafted during his 6 years in prison. He has 2 sons, aged 24 and 28. Before we begin, I just want to share our agenda and logistical information about the webinar. Our agenda for today will include a brief background on the issue of electronic monitoring, followed by an introduction of our speakers, and then a presentation by James Kilgore. I will then moderate a discussion with our panelists and invite you all to respond to the conversation during the Q&A. You can submit your questions or comments in the chat box at any time during the webinar. However, we'll hold questions and comments from our listeners until the end of the presentation. Also, our webinar will be recorded and will be posted onto the Center for Media Justice YouTube channel for future viewing. Finally, we will be conducting polls throughout the webinar so that we can engage with you as much as possible. You'll see a box appear on your screen, and you'll have a minute to respond to the question. Let's go ahead and try our first poll now. Our question is, how familiar are you with the issue of electronic monitoring? Your responses could be very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not familiar at all. Awesome. Thank you for all your responses. For those who are less familiar with the issue of electronic monitoring, please don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat box or contact us after the webinar. For those of you who are experts on the issue of electronic monitoring, we hope to hear from you during the discussion. Before we dive right into James's presentation, I wanted to take a few minutes to set the stage for why we're even discussing electronic monitoring in this way. Across the country, advocates have been successful in demanding their cities and states dramatically reduce their jail and prison populations. Behind the movement towards decarceration are campaigns to end cash bail, reform punitive drug laws, and hold prosecutors accountable. However, the success of these campaigns are moving government officials to increasingly rely on technology as an alternative to incarceration, especially through the use of electronic monitoring. While electronic monitoring has been used for over 30 years, it's no surprise then that the number of individuals on these devices have more than doubled in the past decade. Today, people are routinely placed on electronic monitors as a condition of parole, probation, and pretrial release. Youth and immigrants are also being placed on electronic monitors. Government officials claim that electronic monitoring is a safe and cost-effective alternative to incarceration. But the reality is that the way that these devices are used, they're merely shifting the site and cost of incarceration from a jail cell to a home. The people on monitors today are afforded few rights and protections, And as the number of individuals on these devices continue to grow, this trend threatens to become a new form of incarceration, something we're calling e-incarceration. That's why in consultation with many of you on this webinar, we've developed these guidelines we're calling Challenging E-Incarceration, guidelines for respecting the rights of individuals on electronic monitors. The purpose of these guidelines is to support advocates and policymakers in abolishing or curtailing the use of electronic monitors. These guidelines have been endorsed by 55 organizations, many of whom have joined us today. We are so grateful for the support of leading national voices like the NAACP, ACLU, Just Leadership USA, and the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We'll also receive support from community-based groups at the front lines of fighting to end cash bail from places like the Chicago Community Bond Fund. This is an amazing show of solidarity, and today's launch of these guidelines are merely a first step in moving together to challenge e-incarceration and reduce the harm being done to people on electronic monitoring. Helping us take that first step today are amazing presenters who will help us understand the need for these guidelines and the urgency in addressing the growing use of electronic monitors. Our first speaker is Topeka K. Sam, the founder and executive director of the Ladies of Hope Ministries, which help women and girls transition from prison back into society through education, entrepreneurship, and advocacy. Topeka was the 2017 Soros Fellow, where she focused on the broken and arbitrary probation and parole system. Sam is a 2015 Beyond the Bars Fellow and a 2016 Justice and Education Scholar, both at Columbia University. Our next speaker is Megan French Marcellin, who serves as the project coordinator for Just Leadership USA, a Working Future campaign. Just Leadership is an organization dedicated to cutting the U.S. correctional population in half by 2030. Megan is the author of several reports on criminal justice reform and reentry, including Back to Business, How Hiring Formerly Incarcerated Job Seekers Benefits from Your Company. Megan has worked with criminal justice stakeholders across the country on issues ranging from sentencing reform to juvenile justice and holds a PhD from Columbia University. And then our final guest speaker is Livette Mays, a volunteer member of the Chicago Community Bond Fund, a community activist and a mother of two. In 2014 and 2015, Livette was detained for 14 months in Cook County Jail because she could not pay a monetary bond. After Chicago Community Bond Fund posted Livette's bond, she spent an additional 5 months incarcerated in her home as a result of electronic monitoring. Since her case ended in 2016, Livette has become a powerful advocate against pretrial incarceration, electronic monitoring, and monetary bail. Livette has appeared on Chicago Tonight and been interviewed by the New York Times. Before we dive in with our guest speakers, I'll turn it over to James Kilgore to set the stage for us by talking about the guidelines we're launching today.
Thanks very much, Myasia, and thanks to everyone for this amazing show of support for turning out to the webinar. This is a really exciting moment. It's the end of quite a long process. I must say, for me, after spending a year on experiencing the isolation, the insecurity, and the fear of being on an electronic monitor, it's really encouraging to see that we're now mobilizing in a way to push back against this. So I thought I would begin by giving people a little bit of history, the background to this campaign, which really began, I think, in October of 2015, when I wrote a report called Electronic Monitoring is Not the Answer, Critical Reflections on a Flawed Solution. And the Center for Media Justice was kind enough to post that to their website, and a number of people responded to this who had been impacted by electronic monitoring in different ways and wanted to find ways to do something about it. So we began a process of kind of getting to know each other, sharing experiences. We had a number of teleconferences. We had a couple of convenings that were organized by the Center for Media Justice. And we found that through that process, we had a number of common issues that came forth in terms of our own experience. Can I have the next slide, please? So some of those issues that emerged were, first of all, the people were under house arrest. They had difficulty in getting movement. Some people were paying enormous fees, $4 to $35 a day. that devices were programmed with tracking and exclusion zones, which kept them out of certain parts of the city, often the parts of the city where their family lived, that there was extreme racial disparity in how this seemed to be being implemented, particularly with youth and with immigrants. And a particular issue was that people that were being released on pretrial electronic monitoring were not being given credit for time served. So after a number of get-togethers, we decided that we wanted to pull together some guidelines and use this as a tool to push back against the narrative of electronic monitoring and the experience that people had. But before we move on, I just want to give a special thank you to a number of people who played a key role in developing these guidelines. And that would be Kate Weisberg, Shuba Bala, Emmett Sanders, Charlene Grace, Monica Cosby, Brenda Sanya, Mike Nellis, and Stephanie Lacambra, and obviously the team at the Center for Media Justice, Malkia, Stephen Renderos, Maisha Hayes, and Danielle Chenoweth, who is no longer there. So I think it's important that their contribution be recognized. So let's talk a little bit about the purpose of these guidelines. Next slide, please. So the first priority is to change the narrative on electronic monitoring. An electronic monitor is not a plastic band on somebody's leg. It's a complex, punitive technology that's an integral part of the way in which the mass incarceration and mass criminalization function, and we need to change that narrative, and I'll talk about the specifics of that in a second. Secondly, we want to reduce the harm that's done by these devices by winning the rights and dignity for people on monitors, advance their rights. And thirdly, in the long run, abolish the use of this punitive technology. Next slide, please. So we want to reframe our understanding of electronic monitoring in 5 ways. The first is, as Maisha has mentioned, is that it's an alternative form of incarceration, not an alternative to incarceration. And so this is one of the reasons why we insist that we use the term ankle shackles, not ankle bracelets. That piece of plastic on your ankle is not jewelry, it's not decoration. It's a tool of incarceration. So we want to make sure that people understand that the fundamental default position for most people on electronic monitor is house arrest, which is a form of deprivation of liberty, which is the fundamental characteristic of incarceration. The second way in which we want to reframe electronic monitoring is that we want to inject the notion of the rights of the monitor, the rights of people on a monitor. They should have rights to do the things that they need to do in order to carry on with their daily lives. When you're in prison, when I was in prison, I had certain guaranteed rights and entitlements. So many hours a week of law library, so many hours a week of recreation. When I was in California, I even had an entitlement to, I think it was 4 pairs of socks. But when you're on a monitor, you don't have any such entitlements, any such rights. You usually get a piece of paper with a 1-800 number on it, and that piece of paper will simply tell you, don't leave your house without permission. If you have any problem, dial this 1-800 number, and you also might be warned that if you tamper with or remove the device, you can be charged with a crime. So the third way in which we want to reframe electronic monitoring is to recognize that it's a form of surveillance. 70% of electronic monitoring devices now include GPS capacity. That means that people's movements are being tracked and stored on a cloud somewhere. We don't know what happens to that information, but we can't imagine that it's good things. Fourthly, we want to recognize that the tracking of bodies, as is done with electronic monitoring, is nothing new. It's part of the continuation of a history of tracking targeted groups of people, beginning with settler colonialism and the tracking of indigenous bodies. Then perhaps its most flagrant practice was during the period of chattel slavery, when black bodies were tracked almost compulsively, and in some extreme forms and punitive forms like branding of people's bodies with the icon of their owner. And fifthly, we want to talk about mass incarceration in relation to incarceration. As Maisha has said, we have electronic monitoring lays a foundation, an infrastructure for the possibility of shifting shifting incarceration from state-funded and state-operated sites to oppressed communities, which must also bear then the financial responsibility and the administrative responsibility of that form of incarceration in their own communities. And we talk a little bit about e-gentrification, meaning that these devices can be used to keep certain people, confine certain people to certain parts of the city and keep other people out of certain parts of the city. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the content of the guidelines. I think most of you have seen the content of the guidelines. These 10 points up here really give us some basic information about the guidelines. I'm not going to go through each one of these in detail, but I want to talk a little bit about the first 5. The first one is ensuring the rights and facilitating opportunities. That means that we think people should be allowed access to employment, access to medical care. They should be able to participate in family, community, and religious activities without having to beg a parole agent or a probation officer every time they have to leave the house. These should be their rights. And I think you're going to hear from Lavette Mays in a little while about how the fact that she was confined to her house ultimately ended up forcing her to take a plea. And I think one of the key rights here is the right to engage in parenting. And house arrest is really constricting if you're trying to parent, and it's also gender biased since the majority of parenting responsibilities fall on the shoulders of women. So there's a gender component to electronic monitoring that we need to explore further. Secondly, we want no net widening. That is, we don't want the Geo Group and Securus Technologies, who are the owners of the major electronic monitoring companies, to find new targets for these shackles. We have 4.5 million people on probation, on parole, on supervised release. If I was the CEO of one of these companies, I'd be looking at the legs of these people as targets for my devices. These people think in terms of 5- and 10-year strategic planning timeframes. We need to curb those plans and make sure that new groups of people are not targeted. Thirdly, we need to ensure that there's no racial and economic injustice in the way in which this is administered. Most of these jurisdictions at present don't keep track of, don't do racial analysis of who's on these electronic monitors. I've tried to get that information from many jurisdictions, and they say they don't keep it. But this is also linked to number 4, transparency of data. We need them to record that. We need to know who's getting put on these devices, who's getting violated, and why. And in terms of transparency of data, we also need to know who's accessing that data that goes on the cloud, that data from people's location tracking, what purpose it's being used for. In Germany, the law says that you have to delete that data after 2 months. We've seen contracts in the US where the provider is forced to keep that data for a minimum of 7 years. This is outrageous. We need some regulation on this. Fifthly, we want no fees to be on a monitor, no fees to be on parole. All of these things are not things that we should be paying to be punished by. Next slide, please. So let me talk about how we're trying to apply these guidelines. We've already developed some case studies based on the experience of many of the people on this call about how the electronic monitoring guidelines can influence practice, can influence campaigns. So you can go to the website that's there and read these case studies. We have a juvenile justice case study based in the Bay Area in San Francisco, based on the experience of Reentry Solutions led by Rebecca Brown, which got reparations for illicit fees that were charged by electronic monitoring providers. We have a case study of parole in Illinois, where we developed a model state legislation for conditions of people on parole with electronic monitors. You're also welcome to look at that piece of legislation, which the full text of that is on challengingincarceration.org, and we think this can be replicated in other states. It didn't pass, but it wasn't discussed in the Assembly in 2017. We intend to bring it back. And then thirdly, I see from the notices here that people in Chicago are deep in the call, and they've helped us to produce this case study of pretrial justice in Chicago and Cook County. And we know that, as Myasia mentioned, that decarceration and ending cash bail are primary issues in the struggle against mass incarceration. And the people in the Chicago Bond Fund and the Coalition to End Money Bond have done a great job in terms of weaving the principles of the guidelines and their own understanding of electronic monitoring to make sure decarceration doesn't mean reincarceration for people in their communities. Next slide. So I want to just wind up by asking for some next steps. First, I want people as much as possible to share the guidelines, and in particular, we want to share the guidelines with people who are critically impacted, people who are wearing that shackle on their leg, people who have a loved one wearing that shackle on their leg. These guidelines are vehicles by which they can push back, by which they can demand their lawyers, by which they can demand their probation and parole officers to treat them with dignity and give them the rights that they need and the freedom that they need to carry on with their lives. Secondly, we want to connect the guidelines to concrete campaigns as the case studies have done. So we want you to share your experiences with us and with each other. We want to build a network, a coalition. We want to have some events in different cities. I know there's a lot of people from Philly there. Philly, we're coming your way with some interventions around the issue of incarceration because we know it's important to you. And lastly, ultimately, we want to build model policy and model legislation so we can push back against incarceration, so we can develop genuine alternatives that get people out of jail, out of prison, and give them freedom in the community, freedom to build their communities, and not reincarcerate them in their communities. Thank you very much for listening.
Awesome. Thanks, James. So now I'm going to ask you all to fill out our next poll, which is, have you or a loved one ever been impacted by electronic monitoring? Simple yes or no. Okay, interesting, pretty split. Thank you for your responses. Given that there are some folks that haven't been infected by electronic monitoring, I'm going to first turn to Lavette to talk about her experience. Lavette, can you talk to us about the conditions you faced while you were incarcerated and how that compared to the conditions you faced while you were on electronic monitor?
Yes, I was incarcerated in 2015. I was released from Cook County in 2016. Contingent on being incarcerated, I can sympathize with everything that he was just notating. When you were incarcerated, you do have a few privileges where you are able to go outside, you are able to get certain things, and have movement. It's no way a highlight because it's all a part of incarceration. But once you have been given the privilege of going home and you're still on electronic monitoring, it doesn't stop there. It continues to be a huge difference. It's always like the public would think that it is very easy and simple, that you're not impacted because when you go home, it's another part of you're the free people. You're not free when you're on electronic monitoring. I spent 5 months on electronic monitoring, and it made me take a plea deal simply because at the beginning of me being at home on trial, I came home and I had surgery. And during the contingent of surgery, I wasn't able to move. Even though I had a judge that gave me movement from 7 to 9, I was not able to move and just go to the doctor for a simple visit. It caused a huge strain on my family because when you're sent home, they're being imprisoned too, because the way that they set up the monitoring, they come in and they search your house. They look in your refrigerators. They do separate things. And this causes a strain on the people who you are living with. I couldn't do certain movements like just every day, maybe go outside. My mother lived in an old house. and it was kind of big. My room was like on the east side of the house, and things just for me to move through her house, like go in the basement to simply wash, go in the kitchen, is too far. My monitor will go off and it will ring back to the sheriff. These things took a huge thing. I had a son who has a disability. I was not able to just simply take him outside and let him just run and play. And without the monitor being able to stay or it will go off. Just doing regular laundry chores, going to the laundromat or going anywhere, you had to get movement. It was a very horrible experience, and it took a huge toll, not just on me, the people who were standing by me, just not being able to go to court. I was told several times, because my court date may not have been placed to the sheriffs to let them know that I'm like, I have to go to court. I wouldn't have movement just to go to court. I'm like, I'm on an ankle monitor. I'm on my way to court. I would literally have to leave out the house and just go and attend court. So it took a huge toll. It doesn't allow you to work. You can't get housing. It's so many avenues that this hurts the person that is on electronic monitoring. And it's time that we put an end to how you're still being punished after you've been tried, your case has been over, or they feel that they can continue to do this and put you on electronic monitoring after you pay or posted your bond. This is how the system in Cook County continues to work. And they make huge profits off of this. So I understand everything that James have just spoke about, because I dealt with all of those issues coming home and being on electronic monitor. It was horrible for me. The sheriffs never complied to how things were for what the judges ordered.
Thank you, Yvette. I'm going to turn to Topeka. The argument we keep hearing for electronic monitoring is that it saves the government money while reducing recidivism and keeping communities safe. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for having me a part of this, James, and the Center for Media Justice. This is amazing work. I see that there's like almost 90 people on, and this is so incredibly exciting. So thank you. And hey, everyone who's texting and chatting in. But I would say that it's a definite falsity that it reduces recidivism. I mean, we just heard some of Livette and the things that she said. And, you know, from the work that I'm doing every single day, we know that, as James is saying, e-incarceration is actually another form of incarceration, right? So if you don't have access to resources, if you have a whole nother surveillance on you, not only is it now affecting you, but more closely your family, right? Your community, your children, when they're invading your homes and your house and you don't have access to anything that's going to help you, then what do you expect is going to happen? People are going to end up violating, you know, for arbitrary nonsense and then end up back in prison. And really, when you think about, I've met so many people who have said because they were on these ankle shackles, right? And the level of what's the word I'm looking for? The level of, I guess, I don't even know. I'm getting like really upset thinking about it right now, just because I remember myself being on the shackle and when the system went out for the cable because I had voice over IP and they ended up calling and they couldn't reach me. I had to be constricted to my house, confined in the house the entire day just because they couldn't get through, knowing I had school to go to and work. And so I ended up having to drop a class because the cable company didn't fix the internet in time, so they couldn't call me, and I had to stay into my house the entire time. So, you know, it's these different levels, and people are actually end up doing things even to violate, to go back to prison, just so that they don't have to be confined to these different levels of, or this extra added surveillance and level of incarceration. So does it reduce recidivism? Absolutely not. Is it saving the government money? I would lend to say no. The fact that people are still paying for it, people are getting government contracts in order to have these systems. So it's just a bunch of BS, really. No, it's that's.
Thank you. I want to stay on you for a minute. Given the amazing work you do with the Ladies of Hope Ministries, what alternatives have you engaged with that accomplish successful reentry without the use of electronic monitoring? And before you answer that, I see amazing engagement in the chat. Like, please, folks, if you have thoughts about successful reentry, we want to hear that as well. So people, go ahead.
Okay. Do you want me to give everyone a minute to say something, or just go ahead and answer it?
No, you can go ahead and answer.
Okay, well, well, all of the amazing work that I am doing, and many sisters and brothers around the country who have been impacted by incarceration and e-incarceration have been able to do it without an ankle shackle, right? So I think of it to say that alternatives would be not to have it. I mean, we already have to go and report. We already have to take drug tests, whether or not we have a drug history, and even with that. I mean, I think that needs to just completely go away as well. The fact that you have these surveillance tactics of people or probation and parole officers coming into our homes at any time, the fact that they can call at any time, the fact that they harass our families and our communities at any time is enough surveillance. We don't need to add a shackle on it in order to have anything, any additional hindrances. And so, the work that we've been doing is really just providing people with access and opportunity to resources so that they can continue to do the work that they're needed. And I think when you want to think about probation and parole, perhaps those systems should look at speaking to those of us who have been directly impacted and really trying to work with us and redirect some of those funds to us so that we can let people know exactly what we need in order to be successful in our lives. So
thank you. Megan, I want to bring you in here, given Just Leadership's mission of cutting America's incarcerated population in half by 2030. How does or doesn't electronic monitoring fit in within Just Leadership's decarceration strategy?
So before I answer, I just want to thank you, Maisha and James, for putting this together. It is, as you said, at this moment where advocates across the country are having successes in the movement to decarcerate the United States. This is incredibly prescient for us to be thinking about. So I thank you for that. And I also thank you for putting together a panel of all women. Rarely happens, so thanks. As you mentioned, our goal at Just Leadership is to cut the correctional population in the US in half by 2030. But it is not to replace incarceration with another form of supervision. We don't want the 2.3 million people who are currently in our jails and prisons to be added to the almost 5 million people who are already under some form of probation or parole supervision. So replacing one bad system with another isn't cutting anything by half. It's just feeding the monster of incarceration. And we believe in alternatives, but we can't replace bars with shackles, correction officers with GPS technologies, and call that a mission complete. And I'd say one of the reasons, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, please look into our Free New York campaign we have going on right now, which is a pretrial system overhaul. But one of the reasons we've been able to do that work is thanks to the extraordinary groundwork laid by Black women who have been bailing folks out for years, like in Chicago. And we fight for pretrial reform so that people have a fair shot at justice. So they're at home with their families and their loved ones, that they have access to jobs. We know that these things affect the outcomes of cases. what pretrial monitoring does is imposes punitive and invasive measures on people that simply can't afford bail. So the result is a loss of due process. It's unseen forms of stigmatization that further criminalize communities. And it actually shifts that cost of pretrial detention from the state to the individual. 49 out of 50 states, you have to pay to have your ankle monitor put on. So who can afford to pay $10 a day for monitoring if they can't afford to pay a $500 bail? And what happens when people can't pay their fines, or when a monitor malfunctions on your job and you're fired, or you work in an industry where you can't hide it at all? Is that pretrial freedom revoked? We haven't even begun to answer those questions. And on the side of probation and parole, where we know that there are states where revocations account for the majority of annual prison entries, we need to really start to think about how electronic monitoring and incarceration continue to create even more onerous conditions wherein people are continuously violated for next to nothing. And so no, the answer is no.
Thank you. My next question is for you and Topeka. One of the conversations that we're having internally is about pushing for the abolition of electronic monitoring for people on parole. I'm curious to know your thoughts about that approach and what challenges you think we might face in making such a proposal a reality. I'll start with you, Megan, and then Topeka, you can chime in.
So the use of electronic monitoring and all the other forms of tracking mechanisms like GPS, someone earlier mentioned drug testing. I have a cousin who has to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and blow into a breathalyzer, destabilizing his capacity to find work, to live a normal life, and frankly, his mental and physical health. All of these things are framed, and not just by the conservatives of this nation, but progressives as well, as a novel strategy for improving the form and function of release. But we know in reality, it will instead establish and implement the widening of our already massive criminal justice system. This is like on top of the police towers we see in low-income neighborhoods, on top of the PD cameras in public housing and on street corners, on top of stop and frisk. Electric shackles create a permanent presence in the day-to-day lives of people already caged in the system. So surveillance technologies only further criminalize people and communities that are impacted. And I feel like it will extend imprisonment outside prison walls and push the carceral state out into our streets and into our homes. And this becomes particularly dangerous because of the justice system we now have under President Trump. We have a attorney general who is hell-bent on reviving tough on crime policies and practices. The extension of mass criminalization through mass surveillance may create fertile ground for a new wave of traditional mass incarceration. So we have to choose people over prisons and justice over structural racism. We have to understand that electronic monitoring only extends pre-existing inequalities in disproportionately low income and immigrant communities of color. This creates new sites of mass surveillance and new forms of punishment altogether.
And then same question for you, Topeka.
You know, Megan hit it. I could just talk just to be talking, but I don't like to do that. I think that she hit every point that I actually even thought of, and many that I didn't. So I would leave everyone with that. Yeah.
Okay, no problem. So at this time, I want to ask you all listening a question through our poll, which is, would you be supportive of eliminating electronic monitoring for people on parole? Yes, not sure, or no, can be your responses. A lot of people saying yes. That's awesome. Livette, how did your experience of the court system and electronic monitoring lead you to become an activist with the Chicago Community Bond Fund?
Contingent on when I was incarcerated, I couldn't believe that, never been going to jail there in my life, not even as a juvenile, that this was happening in the United States of America. The only time I went to court was for jury duty. And when I sat in the jail and I seen the amount of women with just only $1,000 could have bailed out 10 women who sat there in cells, and it was outrage. I couldn't believe it. I was so angry by it, and it took me so long to just see how our system was so broken and how it created a problem. Because of people like Community Bond, and because I had a support team that helped me tremendous by helping me get out of jail, be able to work my purpose, and let people know and speak out. This was huge for me, because with Community Bond, they're not just an advocacy program, advocacy group. They work with everyone that they have that's been incarcerated, that has not been incarcerated, for little petty crimes to any crime. And this has been huge for me to work with an organization that actually put their money where their mouth was and able to help people in the community and help people who have been incarcerated for pretrial, and also for pretrial and detention, and also for money bond. They've been there to support a lot of people and stand behind people and help them actually when they're out. They just don't bail them out. They follow them, they help and make sure that these people are still being able to get back and forth to court. This is the kind of advocacy group I wanted to work with that actually help when people have been incarcerated. It takes a whole village when you get out of jail. People do not understand that. Your rights are so. They still have the noose from the time you go out from electronic monitoring to you go to every court date. It never ends. When you get out, you have to have a support team. You have to, because you're losing housing, you're losing income, some people losing their kids. It's a huge thing that you have to have when you get out. And this has made me look, not that I never looked before, but like I said, I had never been to jail. I never knew that this was actually how rights were just taken away. And you did one simple thing. It could have been as a kid, as a juvenile, and your whole life is determined by 30 seconds. This is what made me be an activist and be able to stand on platforms like you all at ACLU, CCBF, CGLA, and many more other, and Black Lives Matter. This is something that we're doing the groundwork. And I just appreciate that these advocacy groups, and a lot of them are now being able to be heard and trying to do the footwork to get out and let people know that this is a very injustice in the United States and our laws have to change.
Thank you so much, Livette. James, I want to bring you in here to share some information on where the guidelines have already been helpful in moving policy forward. For instance, you mentioned earlier a case study around what happened in Illinois. Could you share a little bit more information about that? And for folks in the audience, please continue to share your thoughts and comments and questions in the chat box.
Thanks, Mayasia, and thanks to all the panelists for wonderful presentations. We're really magnifying our understanding of this whole process and building some ideas that we can use to fight against decarceration. So I work in a reentry program in Champaign, Illinois, and I kept getting people coming through the door who were on parole, and they were telling us that they were on electronic monitors and they were only being released Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 5-6 hours a day. So we run our drop-in center on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so they couldn't come to the drop-in center because of the monitoring restrictions. So we had to talk to their parole agent to get them even to be able to come into the reentry center, but that still didn't solve the problem of what happened when they got job interviews, other things going on. So we found out that this was really a policy that was being applied across the state in Illinois. And we were lucky that our office is located about 2 blocks away from the office of what I would call maybe the most progressive state representative, certainly in Illinois, but and that's Carol Ammon. So we went and talked to her about this, and she has said that she had some people from her constituency also complaining about the restrictions of electronic monitoring. So we sat down and we talked to her, and she said, why don't you help us draw up a bill about electronic monitoring that will incorporate the kind of guidelines that you're working on into legislation. So she said, let's start with everything you want, because when you design a bill, you have to start with everything you want because some things are going to get knocked out. So basically, we wrote down a wish list of items that we wanted to be in that bill. She forwarded that to the people within the state legislature that actually write up legislation, and she sponsored it, and it got put into the committee. It got discussed. It got a couple of other sponsors, and it's out there as an example of model legislation that'll guarantee people some of the rights that are embodied in the guidelines, like the freedom of movement, no user fees, some regulation of how the data is used, and so forth. So we're that case study is available on the website for this project, and then also the full bill is available on the challengingincarceration.org website under key resources. So I think it's a model. So this is what we want to be able to share, because I've already heard from somebody in North Carolina that wants to try to make use of it and see what they can do with it there. So these are the kinds of things we want to share through this campaign and build a national kind of understanding of this.
Thank you, James. Okay, so I think this is a great time to open up this call for other questions that our listeners may have. Folks, please remember you can type your question in your control panel, and I'll do my best to pose your question to our panelists. There was a question that stood out to me, or a question and comment from Shannon, which says, isn't this basically preaching no consequences for criminal behavior? Topeka, Levette, James, Megan, do you have any responses for how we might be preaching that there should be no consequences for criminal behavior?
I don't think anyone's preaching that there are no consequences here. I think what we're talking about and what we're educating people on is the fact of incarceration and ankle shackles are not alternatives to incarceration. I think we have to be very clear on that, and that it is not helping said population. It's actually continuing to extend out into our communities and harassing not only those of us who are under surveillance, but also our families. I also, I'm going to scroll back on the comments. I saw something else. Someone else can chime in while I find it, but it was in relate to that same thread of thought.
Topeka, can I just add a little bit more?
Yeah.
So thinking about the pretrial context, that's the big context everybody is now talking about. What electronic monitoring does in that case is not monitor people who have been convicted of a crime, but rather monitor people who are too poor to put up bail. That is what it's doing. In replacing money bail with a system of electronic monitoring, you essentially widen the net of who is on these monitors, and on these monitors with extremely onerous conditions as described by Lavette and James, for no other reason except that they can't afford their bail.
Can I add something also?
Sure, absolutely.
So I think to complement what Megan and Topeka are saying, when we talk about people who are on parole, people who are on parole have already done their time in prison. It's not like they haven't suffered any consequences from crime. They've suffered those consequences. Now, all of a sudden, we're going to add more consequences and more incarceration onto a period of incarceration that's already completed. So there's nothing to be, I don't think there's an argument for putting people on parole on electronic monitors. And it certainly doesn't save money because it's an additional cost. It's not as if it's taking people out of prison and putting them on an electronic monitor. It's adding that onto their parole. But I think we need to put that question into a bigger frame, and that is that we've seen decades and decades of people paying ridiculously harsh consequences for crimes which are even dubious as to whether they should be classified as crimes, let alone be given 30, 40, 50 years for drug cases. So I think we need to remember that we're dealing in the context of a system of mass incarceration and mass criminalization, and pushing back against decarceration is part of pushing back against that whole mentality that somehow the only way to deal with people who do wrong, who do harm, is punishment.
And can I also make a statement on that too as well? People have to understand that when you're on house arrest, your case have not been completed. You are supposed to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. It is the other way around. You are guilty until proven innocent. This has to stop because our pretrial detention is so short, because our communities are low poverty. We cannot afford to pay bond as high as the courts are setting them. These people are considered to be innocent, and every day they continue to pay. They cannot work. It is put in their case file as pending. A company will not hire them. They're not able to move about and participate in family activities, community activities, everyday life. These people are considered to be innocent until proven guilty. Some of them have little petty crimes, and they're spending enormous time because we would rather take more money and place it in jail system and incarceration than putting it back in our communities. So this is huge. When you say that, you're putting everybody in one box and circle and saying, this is okay in the United States of America. It's not. It does not work. It does not fit.
Thank you all so much. I want to try and get in a few more questions, even though we have just a few more minutes left. There's a question from Dana in a comment. Thank you for coordinating a really excellent panel, and thanks to each of the amazing speakers. Does anyone have any specific tips for public defenders or criminal defense attorneys?
Yeah, in fact, we do. Stephanie Lacombe from EFF, from Electronic Frontier Foundation, has designed an information sheet for lawyers. It's kind of connected to the campaign, and we also worked with her to come up with some things for a lawyer to ask for if they've got a client that's going to be put on electronic monitor, to ask them for specific kinds of conditions. I mean, some of the things that we put on there was, first of all, not to put them on GPS, put them on a device that doesn't track their location, to get them as much movement as possible, to get them automatic movement for certain things, and obviously to have them not be paying for that. So I think there's ways in which lawyers need to be informed. I also think that people who catch cases need to be informed, and they need to be pushing their lawyers and pushing the courts to give them a different sets of conditions if they're stuck on electronic monitoring. We're not promoting monitoring, but we recognize it's a reality, and the conditions that are specified for somebody can make a big difference in their quality of life, as the case of Lavette shows us.
And we're also putting together a network of attorneys, criminal defense attorneys and public defenders through the Probation and Parole Project. that will help people navigate these systems and also represent people appropriately without just pushing people through having to force plea and do these things. So if anyone is interested in being a part of this network, just reach out to James or myself.
And just add on to that, I'll say that we have the endorsers of this campaign include the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, the National Lawyers Guild, the National Association for Public Defense. So there's a whole host of lawyers who are coming on board to this discussion. And I think there's ways we can work with Topeka's network to expand that core of legal practitioners.
Thank you for that. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. We're pretty much running out of time. Before we close out, I just want to thank again Megan, Topeka, and Livette again for such a great dialogue today. If you would like to get connected to our panelists, please look at the screen. You can find their contact information right there. And I see a lot of questions around what's next, how do we be in touch? Well, my next poll question is, would you be interested in joining our organizing call? When you respond to this poll, it helps us figure out who should we reach out to after this webinar. So please take a minute to go fill that out. Everyone who has RSVP'd will also get campaign materials and the guidelines and stuff following this webinar. Great. So as I mentioned earlier, a recording of this webinar, I just got the results from the poll. Yes, please email me, 94%, so that's awesome. You will definitely get a follow-up email with us and an invitation to our organizing call so we can strategize together on how to get these guidelines implemented and stop the use of electronic monitoring. As I mentioned earlier, a recording of this webinar will be available on our website in the next few weeks. If you would like to be in touch with either myself or James, you can find our contact information on the screen. And thank you again so much for joining this webinar on digital prison. We hope you enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you, everybody.